Obviously, a bigger turnout than we expected. We thought it weekday in January probably would be a small group. That's what was planned on.
Yeah, when we were scheduling a spot, I wanted to be an informal thing that's really small, so this is perfect.
The only thing I asked about it is my original intention. I have a number of documents I'm going to show, and that's the whole basis of this. Some of them are quite valuable, and my original intention would be a small group and be intimate. We could look at the documents closely. Obviously, you're going to have a chance to look at them closely, but I would ask, and it'll be at the end now because there's so many people here, I would ask that you please not handle them. Some of them are fairly fragile and some of them are quite valuable. Please be careful at the end when we look at it closely.
Sure, why not? We've got more seats left. Anyone have any seats next to them?
There's a few seats up in the back.
Yeah.
For those of you who just came in, there is coffee here. If someone would like a cup of coffee, or a cookie. Still a few voices. There are some seats up in the back. Fall asleep, don't score. Ready? About 80. We hope for 20. So you go exceeded your objectives. Well, in January, you know, on a weekday in January, right?
All right, well, we may have some other people trickle in, but we want to get started. We know that God has a lot to share. And we don't want to waste any time. So, welcome. I'm Becky Blackburn. I'm the Public Services Librarian here at the Athenaeum. So glad you're all here. I'm here to introduce he who does not need to be introduced, but still, this is our first in a series. This is our archive guide, taking items from the archives and Bob giving you the stories and the things behind that. So it is going to be every month until May. So please go in, sign up, look at the different topics, and they're all listed in that thing event calendar. So hope to see you back. Barbara?
As I said, the original plan for this, we have an archives, for those of you who don't know, and I think most of you know. If you step into the main part of the library and look up, that third floor that you can see up there, that is a climate-controlled archives for the city of Westfield. And we have all kinds of collections up there that have accumulated over the years. Now, most of you know about the museum we have in here and museum artifacts, and they can be put out in public. You can have various displays at various times we've done it. But the archival material just doesn't lend itself to that very well. First of all, much of the material is fragile. Other parts of it are quite valuable. And in the final analysis, quite often it's just a piece of paper with writing, and unless it's explained, it may not make an awful lot of sense. So what I wanted to do is to show some of the things we had in the archives. So the idea is that we'd have a small group of people meeting during the day, and I'd be able to pull the documents out, you'd be able to look at them closely, and I'd tell you a story about them. So the plan was to do three things. One, show the documents. Two, because I'm a retired professional historian, to tell you what a historian does with these things. How do you interpret them? How do you use them? And finally, because they're all things that relate to Westfield, to tell you something about Westfield's story, in most cases, bits of the story that haven't been told before. I mean, you can get one of the histories and look at all the standard General Shepherd and the rest of it, but these would be bits and pieces that haven't been covered. So that was the idea. So we're doing the first one today, and we're talking about where wealth comes from. One of the most important families in town throughout its history has been the Fowler family. In fact, this library, part of it is the Fowler Mansion. The Boys and Girls Library is the Fowler home. And the question is, where does the money come from? And how is it used over the years? So let's go back to the magic year 1783. We've got a brand new country. Peace treaty has just been signed with the British, and America exists. The only trouble is it's in terrible shape. It's broke. It owes literally tens of millions of dollars to the French and to the Dutch and to various other investors. It has an army that hasn't been paid in years and is very angry about that. It owes debts to almost every single person in the country who had any money to begin with. Everybody's bankrupt. And the British, being the British, saying, to hell with you, you're not going to be allowed to trade with anybody in the world. We still dominate the seas, and we dominate the places where you used to sell your raw materials. We're not buying anymore. Bankrupt, useless, helpless. That was the nation. It was so bad that 4 years later, there was a revolt in Massachusetts known as Shays' Rebellion. A significant minority of the population simply said, everybody is demanding we pay off our debts and we haven't got any money. We're going to shut the courts down so nobody can collect the money. And if you try to do anything about it, we're going to shoot you. Now, many of those men were ex-servicemen. Not all of them, but many of them were. And the movement was particularly strong here in Western Massachusetts, which had always been a bit uncomfortable about the revolution from one time or another, wasn't too terribly happy about this new national government, and essentially said, we ain't going to participate. Well, that didn't last very well, but it bothered those people in power enough. It disturbed them enough that they decided they ought to get a government that worked. Because from 1783 to 1786, when this happened, there essentially was no government. Well, they called it the Articles of Confederation, but it didn't work. They decided they better get a government that worked. So they created the Constitution and created the United States of America out of the Constitution with a central government that could tax. That was the key part of it. it could tax. All right, so now we got a government. It's still broke. Yes, it can tax, but what are you going to tax? Nobody else has got any money. The government had just one thing of value. It had land. Now remember, those original 13 colonies were a pretty narrow band along the seacoast. This 1789 new country, in theory, owned everything to the Mississippi River. The government now has masses of land. It can sell that land. Now there's only one problem. The land is occupied. There are people called Indians, Native Americans out there. Thousands of them. They, however, had a problem. And their problem was that they had supported the British during the Revolution. Almost all of them. They didn't realize it, but when the British were defeated and left, they were alone. They were now isolated. And the British weren't coming back to help, even though many of them thought they were. Now they're vulnerable. And the government decides that what it's going to do is it's going to utilize their lands to raise money to make the government work. But we're going to do it legally. We're going to do it with treaties. Now, the biggest organized group of the Native Americans who had fought on the British side were the famous Six Nations of New York State, the Iroquois. They had been the largest organized group. They had provided the most significant fighting force against the colonialists. And now they're alone out there. So the new government sends a group out to negotiate a peace treaty. That peace treaty is called the Treaty of the Big Tree. Now, when I was an undergraduate in college, I went to a small state college in Western New York State. It was a college in a small town. Town had 4 bars in it. One was the local dive bar, purely for locals. One was a purely college bar. One was an old hotel in town that had a room for the locals and a room that the college students went to. And one was a fancy inn. The inn had a nice dining room, and it had rooms for visitors to the town, and it had a nice, quiet inn bar, which, if you were feeling flush as an undergraduate and you wanted to impress a date, you could take her there. But as long as you behaved yourself, you could go to that. The name of the inn was the Big Tree Inn. Now, as an undergraduate, I had the faintest idea what it was. I lived in the town, went to college, and drank beer in the place occasionally. The Big Tree Inn. It was only later that I discovered that the Big Tree was literally that. It was a tree that was in the valley just down the hill from the college. And that it had been the central council tree for the Seneca Nation, which was the largest of the 6 nations that made up the Iroquois. They were called the Keepers of the Western Door. They ruled Western New York State, Western Pennsylvania, and parts of Ohio. And this was their center. 1797, the new government of the United States sent a party out to negotiate a treaty up there. This is the treaty. Now, this is not the original. The original was in the archives of New York State and burned up when the archives burned in the 1870s. This is an attested legal copy made in 1812. And the reason why we have it is because the delegate from the United States government to the Indians at the peace treaty was our own William Shepherd. He was the superintendent of Indian affairs. In other words, whatever agreement was to be made, he was to supervise it and make sure it worked. This is the treaty. It is the earliest extant copies done for Shepherd's benefit. And exists here, not in the archives of the New York State government. Under the treaty, the Seneca gave up much of their lands in New York State, except for a reservation, and their rights to the Pennsylvania and Ohio lands. In return, they were to be paid $100,000, but they didn't get $100,000 in cash. Remember, the government doesn't have any cash. What they got was $100,000 in government bonds, which would be supervised by William Shepherd. And he would decide when they needed some part of it and what they could use some parts of it of. And his job was to supervise what happened to those lands. All right, we now have land. Second part of the story. The government decides that it's going to get rid of one of its problems with those lands. It's going to give parts of it to all those ex-soldiers. Couldn't pay them money, couldn't give them its back pay, but it could give them so many acres of lands in this new, from the Indians' territories. So if you wanted to start afresh and go out west and clear the land and try something, you could do that. If, however, you were desperate for cash, you could sell that land grant. And most of the revolutionary soldiers, in fact, sold their land grants. Well, who in the world are you going to sell your land grants to? Not everybody in America was poor because of the revolution. Some people had made money. Now, in World War I and World War II, there was enormous outcry about merchants of death and people who had gotten rich off war. Well, that was true. In every war, somebody gets rich. The guys who supply the guns, the guys who supply the food, the guys who build the machines, they make money. That was true in the Revolutionary War, too. There was a significant percentage of the colonial population who made money off the American Revolution. Remember, the French and the Dutch and the rest are giving millions of dollars in cash to the revolutionary government to fight the British. Somebody ended up with that cash. It generally went into the hands of a group of merchants from the coastal seaport cities and towns. The guys who'd been importing goods all along, the guys who'd been exporting goods all along. They kept doing it. They ended up with the money. A large group of them were from Connecticut. And Connecticut had had a problem with creating this consolidated new government to begin with. Each of the colonies had been established by the British and had been established with a north and a south border. This is the colony of Connecticut. It will exist from this line to this line. But none of them had a western border. All of these coastal colonies essentially said that their western border was the Pacific Ocean. Now that led to some conflicts. Massachusetts and New York had a problem. When the country was established in 1789, what the federal government said was, if you come in as a state, you have to give up those western claims. Yes, we, the government, will now have all that land and we can parcel it out. I've already told you that story. Connecticut refused. Connecticut said, we will only join this government if we get the right to hang on to a piece of those western lands. Because Connecticut was one of the most prosperous and successful states, they wanted Connecticut in, and so the government backed down and it said, okay, you can keep a piece of those western claims. We'll call it the Western Reserve of Lands for Connecticut. Some of you may have heard of a college out in Ohio called Case Western Reserve. The Western Reserve was Greater Cleveland, what is today Greater Cleveland. That was the Western Reserve. That was this piece of land that Connecticut hung on to. And now the Seneca Indians have said, okay, we give up the rights to it. Now Connecticut owns that land. Well, it's no good to Connecticut unless they can sell it to somebody. So they did. There were a group of merchants who formed the Connecticut Land Company, and they agreed to pay $1.2 million for that land. Now, they didn't pay $1.2 million. This was a mortgage. So as they sold the land, they would pay off the debt. They weren't all Connecticut men. There was a Westfield man involved. His name was Samuel Fowler. Now, the Fowlers were one of the old founding families in Westfield. They'd been here from the beginning, generation after generation, and as one of the original proprietary families, every time a new piece of land was divided up, the proprietors got first dibs. So the Fowlers and the Deweys and the Nobles and the Loomises and Sacketts got the best dibs of the best land around here every time they got a new piece. Now, the Fowlers were not merchants. They were farmers like almost everybody else in Westfield. Westfield was a frontier community. This wasn't a place to be a merchant. You were a farmer, maybe you owned a mill. But over the generations, the Fowlers had accumulated hundreds of acres of land. Now, they didn't farm it themselves. We're not talking about huge farms. They rented out the land. So they were collecting rents. They were collecting, and occasionally they'd sell a piece of land. That's how they accumulated. So they were, within the context of Westfield, a prosperous family. They weren't one of these great merchant capitalists of Salem or someplace, but they were a prosperous local family. They were prominent in the politics. So prominent in the politics that by the time we get to Samuel's generation and the Revolutionary activities start, he becomes one of the leaders of the revolutionary movement here in town. He becomes ultimately a member of the Committee of Public Safety. Now, that was the revolutionary government that sat here in Massachusetts against the British. And he was the representative from Western Massachusetts. So he's important in revolutionary activity. He's important enough so that when the revolution is over with and we have a constitutional government, governors in the state begin to appoint him to positions. John Hancock here appoints him as Justice of the Peace. That's John Hancock's signature down there. By the way, John Hancock signed everything big. I mean, probably when you were in third grade, you heard the mention of John Hancock signing the Declaration of Independence in a big signature so the king would know he always signed his name big. In later years, John Hancock appointed him state senator. And there's John Hancock's signature. Here he's appointed senator. Now, in those days, there was no Hampden, Hampshire, and Franklin County. There was simply one big county called Hampshire. And so he's the senator from Hampshire to the legislature of Massachusetts. We also have signed documents like this when Sam Adams was governor and when Eldridge Gary was governor, appointing Samuel Fowler to various government positions. So he's prominent, he's known. Well, he's well enough positioned, and Shepherd is from here. And Shepherd is not only superintendent for the Indians in Western New York State, he's also superintendent for the Indians in signing the peace treaty for the Maine Indians. So that Fowler picks up a piece of property here and there and everywhere else. And he ultimately decides that he's going to pick up a piece of property by joining the Connecticut Land Company. We have various stock certificates in the Connecticut Land Company. This is one in which Samuel Fowler purchased stock of 6,000 1,200 thousandths of the Connecticut Western Reserve. I have no idea what that translates into. But we have about a dozen of these documents where he has purchased various stock in that corporation. Now, this is a promotional map of the Connecticut Western Reserve. Now, I know those of you in the back cannot see it, but it says a map of the Connecticut Western Reserve from an actual survey. It is essentially northeastern Ohio. It's Cleveland to the Pennsylvania border. And it is the lands that this corporation got. And it's the lands that Samuel Fowler bought shares of. In fact, light may not be good enough. The ink has kind of faded, but each of these squares, and by the way, that's the traditional square of dividing up lands in the United States. Each of these little squares is 1 mile on a side. And they filled in the names of who the purchaser is in some of these squares, but the ink has faded badly, but Samuel Fowler's name is on a couple of them down in here. These, by the way, are his copies of the documents. We have all the Fowler land documents from this era. So now he's purchased the lands. You've got to do something. I mean, the land is no good. It's just land. It's no good until you can put it into somebody's hands. So he's got a healthy young son, James, who has learned the surveying trade. And so he sends him out to Ohio to these lands he's purchased to open a land office and take this big parcel of land and cut it up into smaller saleable lots and then sell them. By the way, James took his uncle along. Remember that Shays Rebellion I talked about? Well, there were a number of Westfield people who rebelled. Actually, Westfield community was divided because, of course, General William Shepherd gained his fame by suppressing the rebellion. Large part of what he was suppressing was his fellow citizens from Westfield. Among those fellow citizens in Westfield who participated in Shays' rebellion were two older brothers of Samuel Fowler, Abner and Daniel. If you take 10 and 202 south out of Westfield towards Southwick, just as you enter shortly after you've entered the Southwick line, there is Ray's farm stand on the bend. There used to be 20 years ago, 25 years ago, a house right in there, a white house. It burned, I think. That was Abner Fowler's home. Daniel is better known. Those of you in town, you know the Fowler Tavern on East Main Street? That was Daniel's Tavern. So these two older brothers of this great defender of the Revolution, the member of the Committee of Public Safety, they were on the other side. They were part of a very small group of Shayites who were condemned to death after the revolution was suppressed. There were only a handful condemned to death. One was executed. They were in the Northampton jail. And rather mysteriously, they were let out of the jail and they fled to New York State. Now, I don't think it was mysterious at all. There's brother Samuel, who's involved in all the government organizations of the town. I am quite sure an arrangement was made to let Samuel's brothers go. I'm quite sure of that. Anyway, they fled to New York State. And they fled to the western Adirondacks, to Lewis County, an area of the Tug Hill Plateau, Loudville, Boonville. A few of you may know where that area is. It is a god-awful wilderness then, and it's a god-awful wilderness today. I grew up north of that area. It's not a nice place, particularly in the wintertime. Daniel eventually stayed, and there are descendants of his who roam up and down that Black River Valley today. My father was born in the community of Fowler, which was just north of there. Abner realized that you couldn't make a living out there, and he followed his nephew to Ohio and is the founder. Remember, James goes and sets up a shack in the woods to sell land. Abner comes and says, let's have a town. It's called Fowler, Ohio. And it exists to this day. In 2005, descendants of the Fowlers and the entire government of Fowler, Ohio came here to Westfield, and we had Fowler reunion days. Anyway, they went out and they created a town. This is the original plat lines for the town of Fowler. The people who came from Fowler were astonished to see this. This is the original plat lines for the lots that were sold, and the names are written in as they sold the lots. This became a very successful operation. So successful, in fact, that Samuel and James began to buy up more pieces of territory, scattered all across that region. Up on the shores of Lake Erie, there is an Erie, it's called Erie, Ohio. It's right on the shores of Lake Erie. That was a town that they built from lands that they owned. In fact, this Ohio Lands project became so good. This is a poster from 20 years later, but it's a poster for Ohio Lands, selling Ohio lands by county, listing who you contacted in county. Now, this is not just Fowler, it's everybody else out there making money off this great migration west. People here in Massachusetts, particularly among the Shayites, fled. There was nothing for them here. New England soil is thin. It's rocky. It had been settled for over 100 years. The land was all occupied. If you were a younger son or an immigrant, there was nothing for you here. People went west. And throughout this Ohio Western Reserve, they made towns. Now, what I have done is I've simply taken a detailed roadmap of northeastern Ohio. This is essentially the Western Reserve. Each of these black marks, Cleveland's down here, each of these black marks is the name of a little town. And most of these are little towns. They're Southwick size. Saybrook, Thompsonville, Lyme, Windsor, Middlefield, Farmington, Southington, Russell, Fowler, Warren, Deerfield, Salem, Marlborough, Suffield, Brimfield, Westfield, Wadsworth, Manchester. And the ones that these are all Connecticut, Massachusetts. The ones that I haven't named Connecticut, Massachusetts are from New York State. Actually, there are more here. There's Windham, Newton Falls, Wayland. These are all towns from New York State. They're all there. They all went out and got these Indian lands. Samuel Fowler died in 1823. James came back and had an agent out there in that town of Fowler to deal with the lands. By the way, the Fowlers continued to draw rents and sell lands out there up through the Civil War. And we have here in the archives boxes of books of their land deals. James took some of his money and built himself a mansion. Now, by the standards of the coastal merchants and sea captains, by the standards of Salem and Newburyport, it wasn't a mansion at all. It wasn't in that level of house. But it was the biggest, nicest thing that Westfield had seen in 1833. It had imported marble fireplaces. It had plastered interior walls. It had imported glass and lots of windows with glass. So it was a pretty classy place by Westfield standards of the day. We have photos of the house as it looked not too long after it was built. This is the house in the 1870s, say about 40 years later. There are porticos, which is a fancy architectural term for porches, on the front and the back. And this entrance right here, you may recognize it is the entrance to the Boys and Girls Library today. It's the same entrance. It looked differently. This is the back end of it. It looked differently because it, in the classic New England fashion, it had attached sheds, horse barns. By the way, the kitchen was in an attached wooden structure also. But it ultimately, the family, see if I get the generations right here, the granddaughter of James Fowler will ultimately turn the property over to the Westfield Athenaeum. And it exists to this day as the Boys and Girls Library and the Athenaeum offices above it. The offices are in the bedrooms for that mansion. So in a very real sense, then, this Athenaeum is a product of those Indian lands that William Shepherd et al. Got a hold of and brought the results here to Westfield. Thank you very much. Questions?
I'm just curious how we got all of these documents here. How did we?
Well, let me redo a thing that I've done many times. Some of you heard me say it many times. Others of you may not. This is a private library. This is not a public library in the sense that 98% of the rest of libraries of Massachusetts are. 98% of all the libraries in Massachusetts are government institutions. They are owned by the community, by the town. The employees are employees of the town. The budget is part of the town budget. This is not. This is an independent chartered corporation established by act of the legislature as the private library for a group of wealthy families in this town. Over the years, it has come to function like a public library. And if you are not a resident, actually many of the residents of Westfield assume it's a public library because of the way in which it functions. It is not. And from its earliest days, it was established not as a library, but as an Athenaeum. Athenaeum. Try that word. That is a Greek word which means a place of learning. And from the beginning, it was designed to have a lecture hall, to have an art gallery, and to have a museum. And so from its beginning, it was a place where the wealthy families of town could function in their cultural milieu. And when they wanted to dispose of stuff, they disposed of it here. Now, a lot of what they wanted to dispose of was garbage. As I've told the tale a number of times, this was my grandmother's favorite dish. I know it's broken in half and it's got chips out of it, but I can't throw it away here. But at the same time, we got a lot of terribly interesting things. And that's what's going to take place over these 5 months. I'm going to show you some of these interesting things and tell you about it. Any other comments? Yes, sir.
So the folks out in Ohio, they sell a plot of land. They say, okay, this is Milford now, Milford, Ohio. So do they set up the government? Are they the government?
Yeah.
They are the government.
They're the government. They set up their own government.
And so how does local representation happen? How
Well,
does it develop?
ultimately you will get I've forgotten, a territorial government of Ohio.
And they set up registries of deeds? And
Oh,
things
yeah,
like
and
that?
that will all work out.
So
Yeah,
the documents you have, are they deeds, actual transfer papers?
Well, what happened is that ultimately at some stage there will be deeds, but the original records of who got the original grants of land are here, not in Ohio. Because when the people came out from Fowler, they brought their town clerk with them and she spent the whole day in here microfilming. Sorry, Xeroxing.
Yeah.
Page after page after page of stuff, because it was the records of her town. They're here. Yeah.
Could you tell me, Amy, briefly, about the Union Street Fowler? And particularly, I'd be interested, you know, when their sawmill stopped operating.
I can't tell you off the top of the head, but I can simply tell you that one of the things you want to keep in mind is that we're talking about multi-generations of Fowlers, and they were all over the place. And then, of course, these families intermarry all over the place. Some Fowlers leave here and go out to Ohio. When the gold rush happens, some Fowlers go to California. And there's a bunch of them out in Lodi, California right now. And they're direct descendants of this group too. In the late 19th century, America finally settled down enough. And I think it was really after the 1876 centennial celebrations. Suddenly, America got very history conscious. And genealogy started all over the place. And if you do any genealogical work, almost every family has one of these big, thick genealogical books, most of which were published in that era. And reunions began to happen. People began to track all these families. And that's when these people began to come back here as the original. Well, we're not original because these people came from Windsor, Connecticut, but they came back here because their records are here. So I don't know that specific group. I don't.
I can remember the Fowlers and Union Street, well, there was only one left by then, living in a large Victorian house down there at the bottom of the street, just across from the Bush house and so forth. And that was the part of the family I knew of it.
Yeah, they're all over the place. The brick house that's across from South Middle School, it's got white plaster on it that's chipped away. That's the Blackleash Fowler house. I can tell you that the Fowlers in the, say, 1870s era, all the land south of Silver Street, from Little River all the way to 10 and 202, all that land was Fowler land. Up until, what, about 12 years ago, Fowler Farms was still the last big piece of it, the so-called 100 acre.
Yeah.
Down off, behind Colonial, that area in there, all of that. That was the last of it, and I think they sold it. I think there are no Fowlers left in town. Direct Fowler line. I think there are no Fowlers left in town. I think that was the last one. Yeah.
You know, the original Wolfett Meadow, that was Fowler land.
That wasn't Fowler land, but, I mean, obviously, there were wolf pits there at one time. That's why they called it that. A wolf pit, by the way, it was a quite common thing to do, in the early frontier days. You dug a big hole in the ground, you covered it with the brush or something and put a sheep on top of it and you caught wolves. So I thought that's why they call it wolf pit now. That was a pretty common thing. Yes.
I don't know if you know the answer to this, but where did they put all the Indians that were living on that land?
Well, essentially they went to reservations.
Do you know what reservation?
Well, the Senecas still have reservations in Western New York State.
Ah, okay.
And in fact, there are a couple of the past 2 years, there have been major battles in New York State. First of all, to get the casinos, which were Indian controlled in New York State, and then to get back their lands, because they got land, and then of course over the years, the various governments around them chipped away at those lands until the reservations got very, very small. The Mohawks were the keeper of the eastern door. Senecas were the keepers of the western door. The Mohawks, however, were in desperate straits at the end of the Revolutionary War, because the Mohawks had an internal civil war 50 years earlier. Part of the Mohawks had supported the French in the French and Indian Wars. Part of them had converted to Catholicism and supported the French, and part of them had supported the English. Those who supported the French retreated to Quebec. Those who supported the English lost the war. And by then, they were so decimated, their population was so small that essentially they were all moved up to the northwestern corner of New York State, right on the Quebec border, near their cousins over the border. The Oneida, which were a tiny population at that point in time, had supported the revolutionary government. The Onondaga, who were the keepers of the council fire, they were the central governmental group. They were a very, very small population by this time also. The Tuscarora had originally been down in Tennessee or someplace like that, and had been crushed in the Indian wars out there, and they were fugitives, so they were a small population. The Cayuga were always a small group. The Seneca were the only large group among the Iroquois. They were pushed into reservations on the southern border of New York State, and they still have a reservation down there. And there was another border up near Buffalo, up on the northern border, and there's a small reservation up there. Many of them crossed the border into Canada, into Ontario. Yeah.
How did the Fowlers get the prime Indian lands along Little River from where it enters the Westfield River?
When the first settlers came, there were three, and I have no idea what word to use, three groups with identifiable leaders in town. There was Wallop, who was on the north side of the river, essentially Prospect Hill. There was a Muskeg, who was Union Street. And there was Aliquot, who essentially was here, downtown Westfield, Main Street area. And over a period of about 20 years, their lands were purchased under various treaties. We have photocopies of all those treaties in here. The treaties were down in Springfield, but we have photocopies of them. And by the way, if you're interested, there's a book called Indian Treaties of Hampden County, or Hampshire County, I think it's called. They got it by treaty, and the Indians moved west into the Berkshires. All right, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.